Believe it or not, Kazuha was at one time considered underwhelming and disappointing and actually a must-skip for free-to-plays, which is pretty crazy now because last year when he reran, it overcorrected and everyone was saying he was a must-pull, everyone needs him, you have to get him, and now we're kind of going back just a bit below where I believe is true center, that depending on your account, he is either a luxury pull or a must-pull, and you want to watch the video to find out where he fits in on your account. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Kazuha fills a few different functions on the team. He is a buffer, he is a grouper or crowd control, which means he brings enemies together if they're able to be affected by suction, and he is a debuffer, and he is a sub DPS or off-field damage dealer. So effectively, he fits very many roles on your team, and if your team synergizes with these roles, Kazuha is extremely effective. So many different options and so many different nuances as to whether or not he's the right character for your team or for your account. So I'm actually going to go through most of the cast, and by the end of it, you're going to know everything you need to know about Kazuha's team comps and whether or not you need him for your favorite teams. As always, my #1 philosophy behind Genshin Impact is that you should build your favorite characters and build the best supports for your characters. So talking from an elemental basis, if you're trying to build a vaporized team, right, and you're looking at Zhangling on the national team or Amber enabling a Hu Tao Xingqiu team, Kazuha is one of the best characters to enable vaporize because in his Ascension 4 passive, he buffs all elemental damage bonus of the type that he swirls, and you can swirl with the right rotations Hydro and Pyro on vaporized teams. That doesn't mean he's always the #1 choice, because on vaporized teams, you also have the option of running Sucrose, whose elemental damage bonus at C6 is unreliable, but still can be a damage increase, and her elemental mastery is really good for vaporized teams. So oftentimes you can get away with running Sucrose. Personally, I always prefer Kazuha because I find his suction more intuitive. The way he groups the enemies together, I find it much easier to use, and I generally will just always get faster clear times with Kazuha, but I'm fully open to the fact that I'm just Mr. Skill Issue and Sucrose is hard to use for me. I know lots of people swear by Sucrose and they really love her. My favorite thing about her is that she can make certain difficult swirlings easier because she can swirl with her normal attacks, which Kazuha can't do. If you're running a mono team, however, so a mono pyro team centered around Zhangling, so a Dea mono pyro team, a Klee mono pyro team, Diluc mono pyro team, Kazuha does pull ahead as being the clear choice because his elemental damage bonus being larger and affecting all the teammates is going to be the biggest damage increase for your team. Same thing if you're going to go for a mono cryo team centered around Ayaka or centered around Shenhe and you're using Rosaria, Layla, or Ganyu or something like that, a mono cryo team, Kazuha is always the choice that you want to go for. Aggravate teams are a little bit trickier, and generally they even out between Sucrose and Kazuha because on Aggravate you are giving the elemental damage bonus, which Aggravate does scale off of, but Sucrose is also able to give her elemental damage bonus and give a hefty chunk of EM, so technically on paper Sucrose edges out a little bit, although I find again Kazuha easier to use. So if you're trying to max out a Keqing Aggravate team or a Miko Aggravate team, I would personally recommend Kazuha, but if you're trying to save for other characters, you can absolutely use Sucrose instead. And if you like Sucrose's playstyle, if you find that it's totally satisfactory, don't go into it thinking that Kazuha is going to be a big upgrade because he's not necessarily going to be. Another team that I highly recommend it on is a Raiden team. So whether that's a Raiden Hyper team, or Raiden Yaimiko, or Raiden Lisa, or Raiden Fischl, I would always highly recommend Kazuha, not only for the electro damage bonus that he can give, which is very unreliable to get with Sucrose on that team, but also because he does a fair amount of personal damage. He actually does a lot of damage when his burst can infuse with Pyro, and it's going to react if there's electro on the enemy. So this happens a lot with Raiden Bennett teams because Kazuha's burst will always infuse with Pyro with priority. So it'll infuse with Pyro, Raiden and Yaimiko or Raiden and Kujosara will affect the enemy with Electro, and Kazuha will do a ton of damage with overloaded reaction. The final team I want to talk about Kazuha on is a hyper carry team that uses Anemo and C6 Faruzan. So if you are an enjoyer of Wanderer with C6 Faruzan or Zhao with C6 Faruzan, Kazuha can actually be built on a damage build with Anemo damage bonus and crit, and he can actually be a really good grouper and defense and off-field or sub-DPS damage dealer for that team. On all other cases, however, you'll want to build him with just Elemental Mastery. I know there's a lot of nuance with Kazuha teams. Hopefully that was able to give you an idea of my general thoughts on his teams and get you an idea of what kind of characters that he would be good for. If you're not sure, please leave a comment and someone or myself will be able to answer your comment as to whether Kazuha would enhance your team, if you're better off using Sucrose, or if you don't need either of them. Before we get into his build, let's talk about his changes since Dendro. So since Dendro, a couple new teams have opened up for him. So aggravate teams he's really good in because, again, the grouping, the iframes, and his elemental damage bonus scaling with aggravate damage. But spread teams don't use Kazuha. Bloom teams like Nilou don't use Kazuha. Hyper Bloom teams also generally don't use Kazuha, although they're not terrible. You can put Kazuha in them, but it kind of defeats the purpose since they're more single target teams. So what this means is that there's more top tier teams that don't use Kazuha now than there used to be. They used to be that a good portion of the top teams would use Kazuha or Sucrose as their main form of buffing, debuffing, grouping, utility, etc. But now we've come to a point that it's very possible that if one team that you're running as a Hyper Bloom and the other is Mono Geo, that you don't actually need an Animo debuffer for your team, whereas you used to need two. Because it used to be kind of maybe Raiden Hyper Carry and Ayaka were more common. Or you might be running a variant of the national team that would use Kazuha as well. So more often than not, you're going to wish you had two Kazuhas or Kazuha and Sucrose. Whereas now there's a lot more options. He hasn't gotten any weaker. He's still very strong. In fact, he's even gotten stronger because now there's aggravate teams that he's really good in as well, but he's much less of a must pull than he used to be. We haven't really talked about Venti at all, so I will throw in a little bit of a comparison versus Venti. Venti has a different kind of suction that's better for small, more spread out mobs, so there are definitely some Abyss Chambers where Venti will feel better. Venti also gives an energy refund, whereas Kazuha gives the damage bonus. So basically Kazuha is better against big mobs that are more resistant to sucking because Kazuha does actually have a stronger suction power than Venti does. It's just not as widely reaching. So I'll generally always recommend Kazuha because even if Venti's better, Kazuha can always make do, whereas Venti definitely does feel kind of scuffed. Venti's more of a luxury pull, whereas Kazuha's more of a staple pull, I would argue. So let's talk about his build. My build has 735 Elemental Mastery. That's generally the only stat, well, it's actually one of the two stats that you generally want to be concerned with for Kazuha. The other stat is your energy recharge. Now mine is running a scuffed level 40 Favonius sword. Normally I'll be running this level 60 Favonius sword. Obviously you do want a level 80 or 90 it for that extra energy recharge, but in general I do recommend the Favonius sword. If you're running a quick swap Dendro team, you can use the sacrificial sword, and if you're on a Raiden team or another team that provides an absolute ton of energy to Kazuha and you have a lot of energy substats on your artifacts, you can go with the Iron Sting or the Takubo umbrella weapon. Some people think this weapon looks good with him aesthetically, and I understand that the colors match, but it looks really weird. Are you guys okay? If you like this weapon on Kazuha, are you okay? It looks weird. For stats, you want to go with Elemental Mastery, and Elemental Mastery in general. The reason why you want to go for the Favonius sword over Iron Sting is because if you go for Iron Sting and you don't have an absolute ton of energy recharge substats in your artifacts, you're going to have to go for a main stat Sands. And a main stat energy recharge Sands just provides you a total of less Elemental Mastery than if you went for an energy recharge weapon and an Elemental Mastery Sands. Now, if you happen to not have an Elemental Mastery Sands and you're tired of farming that domain, then go for it. But the Sands is generally actually the easiest piece to get Elemental Mastery on. Then you'll just be looking for Elemental Mastery and maybe some ER on your Feather and Flower. If you're running Favonius Sword, of course, you are going to want some crit rate. You don't need an absolute ton of crit rate though to proc Favonius because his skill has multiple hits and normally will be hitting multiple enemies. So I have about 25% crit rate, and that is more than enough. I crit pretty much every time and don't really ever have a problem, especially since in some cases you're going to be getting multiple skills in per rotation. So yeah, leveling up his talents is the good thing to do, but not a necessary thing to do, right? You don't need to focus on crowning his talents unless you're doing that aforementioned build where you use him with C6 Farazan and Zhao or Wanderer, in which case leveling up his talents is going to be important. And then the artifacts you're going to build, again, are going to be Animo damage bonus, crit, and either ER or... In terms of how he feels to play and how strong he feels and how strong I think he is, I really do think he's one of the strongest characters in the game. I think he's one of the characters that unlocks your account the most, at least for those of you who, like me, find Sucrose a little bit clunky and cumbersome to play. He feels very, very good to play, at least to me. I love that I think it's because his suction, it brings all the enemies right to where your character is, and so it's very easy to position yourself in a way that, and a very predictable way that you can very much easily streamline how you're fighting the enemies. And I find his suction power much stronger and more predictable, and I really feel his personal damage and that's something a lot of people don't take into account, both his personal damage and aggravate, because he's actually going to be proccing a lot of aggravates off field. I've been told that Sucrose is slightly ahead in the damage for aggravate teams, but at least for me, I really feel like Kazuha is the one who pulls ahead in my practice and my clear times. He's also extremely fun to play. He provides that unique mechanic where he flies up into the air and comes down, and it's very dynamic and satisfying to see all the enemies come towards you and how you go up and down, and there's a lot of flexibility that you have and choices that you can make in terms of when you go up to maybe dodge some enemy attacks or come down, whether you should hold his skill or tap his skill. I won't go into detailed rotations. There's other videos you can look up on that for detailed rotations, but in general, it's swirl element you want to buff, group enemies together, and go to town. Definitely one of my top 3 5 stars to get. For future prospects, I mean, I really think it's hard to really see him ever falling out of the meta because damage buffing is just so universal. Pretty much every character is utilizing an elemental damage bonus goblet, and if they're using an elemental damage bonus goblet, then Kazuha is going to be helping them. So any new DPS character, whether they're Hydro and Fontaine or Pyro and Natland or whatever it is, as long as it's not, you know, Geo, then or Dendro basically, Kazuha is going to be effective in that team. So I have a hard time seeing him leave the top meta, at least for certain teams. I think Hoyoverse is very happy with the spot that he's in. I don't think they're trying too hard to like push him out of the meta, although I do think that they're conscious of not giving him too many more tools. I don't think that Hoyoverse wants every team to use Kazuha as the best character. They want to diversify the roster, and so I would expect more good teams to come out that don't use Kazuha in the future, and other restrictions such as, you know, I definitely think that characters like Kazuha were one of the reasons why Nilou has such a restrictive kit, so you can't run a universal character like Kazuha on a Nilou team. And same with Dendro, you know, they introduced a new element that Animo can't swirl. I don't think that that's by accident, and I wouldn't be surprised if they find other ways to not let future characters work with Kazuha, but I do think other future characters will. So I think for future prospects, I expect him to stay at the top of the meta, but I don't expect him to go any higher. I expect his peak to have been just before Dendro came out in terms of the ubiquitousness of Kazuha, but I think he's in a really good spot right now. A much healthier spot, I would say. I would rather have a meta where you don't require, you know, a certain element for pretty much every single team. Because when I started the game back in 2.2, I think it was, pretty much every best team used an Animo character, and it can feel really bad in the beginning because all you have is Animo main character. For the record, Animo main character is really good. If you're new and you're using Animo main and you're not sure who to build for your Animo character, say you don't have Sucrose yet and you miss out Kazuha, build Animo main character. He's really good. Get him the Viridescent Inventor artifact set, you know, level him to 90. He's actually really good, or she. Very good character. For his overall and aesthetic, I mean, I really like his aesthetic. He's a samurai guy with a really cool color scheme on his outfit. I love that kind of mono color outfit, and of course he's Team Canada, which, you know, I live in Canada, so very much appreciate that. Love the, you know, the Japanese samurai aesthetic. My only complaint is that there's no good katana sword that works for him. My biggest complaint is that this sword does not work for him. I'm considering hyper farming artifacts for Kazuha so that I can run him with this sword and have it not matter, because this sword is just so freaking cool and it looks so flipping good on him, and I'm so upset that it doesn't work with Kazuha. Ah! He is one of the characters that will never leave my team on the overworld. His ability to group up not just enemies and enemy mobs in the overworld, but also group up all the drops from enemies rather than running around and collecting them, for him to bring them all together into one place. Like, he can never ever leave my overworld team. It's one of the main reasons that I can't play Nilou in the overworld, is because she doesn't work with Kazuha. So Kazuha is an absolute must, in my opinion, just for the overworld. He's the only character that groups up all of the enemy drops all in one place together. So Yelan and Kazuha, never leaving my overworld team, and he's honestly kind of worth the pull just for that. But where does he fit on my tier list? Well, I just made an updated tier list for the end of Sumeru and pre-Fontaine, so find out right here. It's a really good tier list. People are really liking it, and some people are really hating it because there's some kind of hot takes on there, but I think they are all very justified and very, very true. So definitely check out that tier list. It's a really great video. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about Kazuha or other characters, and me or some of the others will be happy to help you. Bye for now.